Hello, welcome all. Today we have the last webinar from the cycle of webinars, Introduction to Logotherapy, and today's topic is Universal Values and Human Conscious.
Thank you. Nina, before we begin, you have the diagrams, 4 diagrams. When I ask you for a diagram, could you please share the screen between the diagram and me speaking? Thank you. Okay. Now, from the beginning of these lectures, we have raised the question of values in psychology. We have noted that in Frankl's logotherapy, the values or norms of personality are already contained in human conscience, or in religious terms, in the human soul. In other words, we don't have to search for the values or norms which structure the healthy personality, because unconsciously, the human being already knows or can recognize and resonate with them. We discussed in the first lecture that what brings these values from unconsciousness to consciousness is the process of self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is none other than the emergence into self-consciousness of the human soul. Moreover, when one becomes aware of his or her own higher spiritual self, one becomes free. For only then does one possess the power to respond independently to the pressures from within one's own psychophysical self or from the outside. That gives the power of ethical choice, an ability to decide how to act. In other words, once I have an articulated conscience, I have a counterweight, so to speak, to the psychophysical sense. So we then saw in the second lecture how Frankl, in his own journey to logotherapy, initially started from a view which gave priority to the bodily and instinctual level of personality, the school of Freud. He then went on to the school of Adler, which stressed the mental dimensions of personality with its concern for control and power. Finally, he developed his own logotherapy, which focused on the noetic or meaning faculty, which is higher than and organizes and directs both the bodily and the mental dimensions of personality. After that, in the third lecture, we saw how logotherapy supplements psychotherapy. Its crucial task is to prompt the patient towards the recognition of the goals and values in his or her own life, the accomplishment of which psychotherapy may then assist. Then, in the fourth lecture, we saw how Frankl considered self-transcendence as applicable to everyone. What is meant by this is that self-transcendence can be practiced by the individual, whether one considers oneself religious or not, and that self-transcendence ultimately brings about the emergence of an objective faculty, the conscience or soul. Self-transcendence is a trajectory, a path, on different stages of which the self-transcending individual, be it atheist, be it agnostic or religious, can bring him or herself. Its end station is the self-conscious soul or conscience. The human conscience possesses universal moral content. Frankl called it, in that very important early essay, the imitation of God. He rejected moral relativism. Certainly that strand of Frankl's thought, which I have seized upon. and believed in objective universal values, some of which he specified. Beyond indicating that the human conscience possesses universal values, Frankl, however, did not elaborate fully what these universal values are. He mentioned some of them, but not all, not exhaustively. Are we able to fill in this gap in Frankl's work? In other words, are we able to fill in this pattern or this template or this matrix of universal values, some of which Frankl enumerated? Now, as foreshadowed at the end of the last lecture, it is my view that the universal values which provide the content of human conscience are supplied for Frankl's logotherapy by a great spiritual luminary, Rabbi Judah Loewe, known as the Maharal of Prague. He lived in the late 15 and early 1600s. Frankl was a physical descendant of the Maharal of Prague, and he writes also that the Maharal's work is a spiritual forerunner of his own model of human personality. The writings of the Maharal not only contain a model of human personality which is paralleled by that of logotherapy, Frankl, his writings also set out the content, the universal values of the human conscience or soul. And they do so in relationship to the structure of human personality, which, as mentioned, is similar to that of Frankl's. We shall now proceed to show how the Maharal connects universal values to the human soul, providing normative and or moral content for the structure of personality. Now, the Maharal, as paralleled by Frankl's work, sets out three faculties of human personality: the bodily and mental faculties, plus a third faculty which unifies the bodily and mental dimensions. We could call this unitive, from the expression unity, unify, in the sense that it unifies and coordinates the bodily and mental aspects of personality. This is similar to what Frankl called the noetic or meaning faculty, which gives direction and purpose both to the emotions and desires, the bodily dimension, as well as to the perceptions, the mental dimension of the human being. We have pointed out in Frankl's model that even this higher faculty, which directs body and mind, that is to say, the noetic faculty, itself needs direction. What, after all, should be the content of the meaning, purpose, or direction, which this higher faculty passes on to the lower faculties? And I mentioned before that Elizabeth Lucas, perhaps Frankl's major student, makes this point. Not any meaning, we speak about meaning, but not any meaning is a valid meaning, is a good meaning, is a self-transcending meaning. And Frankl himself would refer to pathological meanings and so on. So, although this point needs clarification in Frankl's work, Frankl was himself aware that the content of the noetic or meaning faculty could also be pathological. It was specifically a stance of self-transcendence which assures that the meaning which guides the human being is an authentic and not a pathological one. In other words, a truly self-transcending meaning. Could I ask you to put on the first diagram, Nina? Nino, thank you. The Maharal of Prague makes essentially the same point. He states that in addition to these three faculties of personality, there is a fourth one, which encompasses the bodily, mental, and unitive or higher organizing meaning faculties of personality. This fourth dimension could be called the spirit, which organizes or orients the other three faculties. Optimally and desirably, this spirit can be one which in Frankl's term, we would call self-transcending. That is, genuinely spiritual in its orientation. Or at the opposite extreme, it could be self-absorbed, materialistic, and self-interested. So in other words, this word spirit, this orienting spirit is used neutrally. It can be either a self-transcending spirit or could be a self-absorbed spirit. From the self-transcending side of this orienting spirit come ethical qualities of emotion, perception, and comprehensive outlook or meaning. From the self-absorbed and self-interested side of this orienting spirit come interest-driven and more corrupted expressions of emotion, perception, and comprehensive outlook. Now, diagram 1 in the shaded surrounding zone indicates this orienting spirit as the encompassing moral condition of human personality. Could you put on diagram 2, please? And we'll share the screen with it too. Within the encompassing or orienting spirit of the human personality, we find next the three faculties of personality. As we've mentioned before, the bodily, or also known as somatic, the mental, psychological, and the unitive, or meaning faculties. These faculties are activated in their differing potentialities or possibilities for conduct according to the orienting spirit, whether, as which we've discussed, whether it is along the spectrum from self-transcendence, wherever it is along the spectrum from self-transcendence to self-absorption. The bodily dimension is characterized by desire or want in relation to objects of bodily emotional desire. Depending on the encompassing spirit, desire can relate to its objects in a moral and sanctified way when oriented by a spirit of self-transcendence, or it can relate to its objects in a self-indulgent and immoral way when oriented by self-absorption. The key characteristic of the second, the mental faculty, is its perception and judgment of oneself and of one's relation to others. When guided by a spirit of self-transcendence, the mental faculty takes on balance and objectivity of perspective. When it is guided by the opposite, namely self-interest, its sense of perspective and relationship towards oneself and others, towards oneself and others, becomes partial and subjective. Diagram 2 shows the inner faculties of personality within and coordinated and conditioned by the outer or encompassing orienting spirit. It is represented in the inner right horizontal zone, that blue zone, which you can see in the diagram. And I should mention also that the unitive dimension, the meaning dimension, is one which could similarly be, is similarly affected by the orienting spirit. In other words, it can also be a meaning, a comprehensive meaning, which is a self-transcending meaning, or it could be a if you like, a pathological or an ideological or a or a worldview which simply rationalizes material interests. Okay, let's have diagram 3, please. Now, the Maharal goes on to explain that there are 2 basic dimensions in which the human being, and specifically the faculties of human personality, operate. One of these, and we're looking here at the green zone here, one of these is in relationship to oneself. Namely, we are calling this the personal dimension. And the other is in relation to other people, which is here called interpersonal. The dimension of relationship to oneself is expressed by the Maharal and has traditionally been understood in theological terms as the relationship of the person to God. And this is because the innermost self, the I, the person, the highest faculty, which has to do with meaning and purpose, the soul, comes ultimately in the course of its self-transcendence to affiliate itself with God. In other words, the innermost self is made in the likeness of and is drawn to God. My personal identity and my relationship to God come together. In other words, when I relate to my soul, when I relate to myself, I relate to God, because my innermost self is something which ultimately comes to imitate the divine. So personal identity is actually about one's relationship, in theological terms, one's relationship to God. Since my innermost person is a spiritual self made in the image of God. Now, so therefore we have those 2 dimensions, and as mentioned before, that is a comprehensive, well, it's a major classification. It's not wholly, it's not exclusive, but it's a major classification of human human personality in its relationship to others, to oneself and to others. Could we now please have diagram 4? Okay. Now, since the 2 major dimensions of human conduct are personal and interpersonal, divine commandments are similarly divided into 2 categories. Commandments relating to the relationship of the human to God. I'm sorry, this should really be, I'm sorry, your diagram 4, yeah, this is correct. Correct, you're right, sorry. The commandments relating to the relationship of the human to God, which, as explained, have to do with personal identity, and commandments relating to conduct between persons. In other words, the inner 3 faculties of personality, bodily, mental, and unitive, each operate within 2 dimensions, the personal and the interpersonal. That gives us, that gives us the 6 altogether, a matrix of 6, as which you can see is that those inner 6 cells there. These 2 dimensions are represented in diagram 3, the previous diagram, in the inner left vertical zone. So a matrix of 6 squares or cells are formed from the horizontal axis. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Sorry. From the horizontal axis of the 3 faculties of personality, and the vertical axis of the 2 dimensions of human conduct, personal and interpersonal. The Maharal of Prague, at this point, calls upon an immemorial, an ancient code of a historical moral code commanded to humanity by God. as that which supplies the moral or normative content of the cells of this matrix. This code consists of 7 universal laws. You'll wonder why I'm saying 7. So far, we only spoke about 6, but we'll come to the 7th in a minute. This code consists of 7 universal laws called after the biblical figure Noah. I think it's in Russian, we call it a Nu, to whom the final 7th law was given. And this name, the name given to this comprehensive moral code, are called the Noahide laws. Noahide comes from the name Noah, Noahide. In other words, these are the laws given to Noah, who was the ancestor of all humanity, the survivor of the flood, and all of his children, all of which is humanity at large. It's called the Noahide laws. On the basis of these laws, God renewed civilization after the flood. These laws, which were authoritatively reiterated at Mount Sinai generations later through Moses, are historically binding on all humanity, the descendants of Noah. Now, the great novelty of the Maharal of Prague is to explain how these laws supply the normative content to the model of human personality with its subdivisions. This normative content fills out the structure of personality as follows. The norm governing bodily desire in its personal dimension. So if we look at that cell, which is the intersection, right, between the bodily and the personal. So that is the Noahide law of permitted and forbidden sexual unions. In the interpersonal dimension of interpersonal dimension of bodily or material desire, just beneath that cell, it is governed by the Noahide law prohibiting theft. Now, this requires a certain amount of explanation, but basically, sexuality relates very deeply to human identity. And that is why it is in the personal dimension. It defines who I am. People tend to say, to justify non-acceptable sexual relations as permissible because they're based on consent, but really that is irrelevant. Consent does not make a sexual union moral. So it is, but rather it has to do with my own identity. Even if siblings would agree to a sexual union and there would be consent between them, it would still be an immoral union. That is why, that is because sexuality is essentially a matter of personal identity. It has to do with who I am, how I am constituted, etc. This is a topic which requires elaboration, and maybe this is not the place, but I'm happy to explain it later. Now, whereas you can see the one beneath it, the is theft. Well, that is clearly an application of human desire, bodily desire, in relation to others. A person wants the property of another and seeks to get it without permission. That is that into that space comes the Noahide prohibition of theft. Now, the norm governing the proper character of mental perception in the personal dimension, we come to that is the second orange cell in that central group at the top, is the prohibition of idolatry. Now, idolatry is essentially a corruption of thought which fetishizes the particular in relation to the general, which is God. And Frankl actually used this expression. He even referred sometimes to, he even spoke to one patient, for example, was the idea of depression being a form of fetishization, because a certain person was deprived of their particular employment, they saw life as no longer being worth living. Well, that, said Frankl, was in a sense a fetishization of a particular task and a particular identity which that person had as a member of that particular profession, which they could no longer perform. And that is, and so in a subtle way, that is also a form of idolatry. It makes a particular thing absolute, instead of relativizing it to the general, to God, and seeing that God, in fact, what is absolute is that one has to have the flexibility to reorient oneself in task when a particular task becomes no longer available to one, and not to fetishize the attachment to the particular matter at hand. So then, so when we now, let's look at the mental faculty in relation to others in the interpersonal dimension. That is normatively governed by the Noahide law of justice, which requires an attitude of balance and impartiality in one's judgment of others. That, after all, we have a judicial system, and a judge has to balance perspectives, balanced consideration of both sides of an argument. And in psychological terms, it's the same thing. We have to take up, if you like, a certain balance or a certain equanimity in terms of competing demands or competing claims to one's self. So now, moving into that third, or that final column, which is the unitive or noetic meaning faculty, which is generally the one which is constituted in such a way it's that which is most able to transcend towards and to address the divine. That is governed in its personal dimension, if you like, the personal dimension, by the Noahide law prohibiting blasphemy. This requires that one not rebel against, but rather respect the divine. In the interpersonal dimension of unitive or noetic faculty, the one beneath it, this is the Noahide law prohibiting killing, because it requires that one not strike at life, which gets its sanctity from God, who has placed, so to speak, his likeness in the human soul. The sanctity of life derives from the fact that the likeness of God is within life, within the soul. The soul gives it. Now, so we've filled out those 6 cells, but there is the last of the Noahide laws, which comes to strengthen the orienting spirit of personality, and that we see in the top left-hand corner. That is the cell, so to speak, which is the divine commandment to effect that the orienting spirit should be as it is, as it should be. Now, this is a very interesting thing. This Noahide law took the form of a prohibition of cruelty to animals, or, for example, even more specifically, to tear the limb from a living animal to consume it. What does it mean? What's the significance of this? So the Maharal explains that a person who cannot wait for an animal to be slaughtered before consuming its flesh, notwithstanding the terrible pain which comes to the animal as a result of this represents an absolute failure to delay gratification. This human being cannot wait. It's the inability to delay gratification at any cost, which is symbolized by this commandment. So either the person, the fulfillment of this commandment indicates that the human being possesses fundamental constraint. In other words, that the human being is able in principle to transcend personal interests. So this Noahide law is outside the matrix of the other 6 Noahide laws, because it is the threshold condition of morality in general. That is to say, the ability to transcend, control, and examine one's interests. It has and gives content to the orienting spirit of personality as a whole. So here are 7 universal laws which are transmitted throughout the religious traditions, but they are also matched to the dimensions of human personality. The 3 faculties of personality and the 2 dimensions within which these faculties operate, as well as the comprehensive orienting spirit of human personality, whether it is on the one extreme self-absorbed or the other extreme, the desirable end of the spectrum, self-transcending. Now, not only do the Noahide laws resonate with the conscience or soul as the moral template, the moral structure of personality, there is also a historical manifestation of the universality of the Noahide laws. And I should mention here that when Frankl was discussing what a universal value is, he spoke about it as something which history has crystallized, which has been crystallized historically, which is there throughout history, which is a value to which history comes back and which resonates across cultures. Now, from Noah to Abraham, there were 10 generations. Remember, Noah is the one with whom this code was completed. And there were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And during which these 10 generations, there was much weakness in the observance of these laws. Abraham was the great promulgator, the great disseminator of monotheism and its moral content. That is to say, the universal Noahide laws. From Abraham to Moses, there were another 7 generations, this time with a progressive strengthening of the observance of the Noahide laws, culminating with Moses and the revelation at Mount Sinai. That revelation also included and authoritatively reiterated the 7 universal laws given to the descendants of Noah, that is to say, all humanity. People tend to think that the 10 commandments are the universal laws. In fact, it is the Noahide laws which were said to all humanity, though they substantially overlap with the 10 commandments which were given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. The Noahide laws are not Judaism, but Jews, like the rest of humanity, are obligated in these laws. From Mount Sinai, these core values came down to Christianity and Islam. But already by another route, they came from Abraham, whose sons were sent to the east, as the Bible records, they come through to early Hinduism and its offshoot Buddhism. Thus, we find that the Noahide laws are at the root of the great world religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Even in secular modernity, the Renaissance, the great founders of modern international law, Hugo Grotius, a Dutchman, and John Selden, an Englishman, reached for the Noahide laws to supply the basis of modern international law. There is considerable advantage in the fact that the Noahide laws represent the root common denominator or shared values of the great world faiths and cultures. The individual faiths and cultures have developed their own rituals and practices. The Noahide laws, on the other hand, are culturally non-specific. In other words, they apply across cultures. This means that they are not tied to cultural particularity, which would make them foreign to the experience of a particular culture. Rather, they resonate in their generality with the adherents of a diversity of faiths and cultures. That the Noahide laws resonate with the human spirit at large. And by the way, I should add, this is an advantage also in psychology, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. It means that when we're speaking about universal values, this removes the need for a therapist to learn everything about the specific culture of a patient, because these are general values. These are values which are found in all cultures. Now, that the Noahide laws resonate with the human spirit at large is indicated by the endorsements of the Noahide laws by leading figures and legislatures of diverse nations. In 1991, the United States Congress, in a special resolution, endorsed the Noahide laws as the ethical bedrock of society from the dawn of civilization. In 2008, the Noahide laws were endorsed by an Australian government as relevant to all matters of life. In 2012, the head of an Islamic state, the King of Morocco, acknowledged the Noahide laws as the bridge between cultures. In 2014, the President of the European Union explicitly endorsed the Noahide laws. Hindus and Buddhists have also indicated an affinity with the tradition of the Noahide laws. For those raised in a wholly secular culture who have little background in traditional faith, and this is very common in the West nowadays, and it may also be common in areas even in Eastern Europe in the aftermath of communism. For these people raised without faith, the Noahide laws may, in their general, neutral, monotheistic character, have a special appeal. Indeed, as we noted earlier, Frankl himself showed that the non-religious person can, through self-transcendence, also come to a general spirituality, one which need not be associated with the ritual of a specific religious tradition, but which resonates with universal values that are in fact spiritually anchored. The universality of Frankl's logotherapy, so therapeutic teaching of self-transcendence, thus fuses and melds with the universality of the Noahide laws. So this, in fact, I believe, is what Frankl is moving towards when he speaks about, when he speaks on the one hand about the human personality, and when he speaks on the other hand about universal values. And this is very important because it supplies us with an idea of the moral structure of human personality. And even though much secular psychology will resist this, by so resisting it, it states, it eliminates the spiritual dimension of the human being. And it's my clear belief, I'm sure, that just as the human being has a body and a mind, a human being also has a soul. And this is a message, I think, of history and human experience. And therefore, we call the so-called science of the soul, the structure of the soul, is vital to the approach to human personality. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Dr. Cowan, thank you very much. And on the behalf of our association and all attenders, I want to thank you for your interesting webinars, for your time, and for desire to share your personal perspective on logotherapy. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.